The moment my grandfather's limousine pulled up to the charity camp, I knew my 18 years of silence were about to end. I was standing in line for a bowl of soup, wearing the same clothes I'd worn for 3 days, my hair still damp from the hurricane that had destroyed half of Miami. I wasn't there because I was poor. I was there because I chose to help. But my grandfather didn't know that. All he saw was his only granddaughter, the heir to a $3 million trust fund, living like a homeless person in a disaster shelter. His face went white. Not from shock at my condition, but from the question that immediately followed. If I had $3 million, why was I sleeping on a cot surrounded by strangers? That question would unravel everything. It would expose 18 years of lies. A stepmother who smiled at family dinners while stealing my inheritance dollar by dollar, a stepsister who lived in luxury, funded by money that was never hers, and a secret so dark that my own mother had warned about it from her deathbed. My grandfather thought he was saving me that day. He had no idea that I had been waiting for this moment for over a decade, quietly collecting evidence, biding my time, watching the woman who destroyed my childhood dig her own grave with every lie she told. What you're about to hear isn't just a story about stolen money. It's about betrayal by the people who were supposed to protect me, the grandfather who chose silence over truth, and the revenge I served so cold it froze everyone who ever underestimated me. Stay until the end, because the woman who took everything from me is about to lose everything she holds dear. My name is Eleanor Maddox, though most people call me Ellie. I am 32 years old, and I work as an independent consultant in Miami, helping small businesses survive their worst moments, which is somewhat ironic considering I spent most of my life surviving my own. I lost my mother to illness when I was 10, and my father to a car accident 4 years later, leaving me orphaned in a family that never truly wanted me. After my father died, my stepmother Diane became my legal guardian. She had married my father just 2 years after my mother passed, bringing with her a daughter named Hadley, who was 2 years younger than me. From the outside, we looked like a blended family learning to heal together. From the inside, it was a master class in how to make a child feel like she didn't belong. Hadley attended the finest private schools in Connecticut, wore designer clothes to family gatherings, and celebrated every birthday with parties that cost more than most people's monthly salary. I attended public school, wore hand-me-downs that Diane claimed built character, and learned very quickly that asking for anything was the same as being ungrateful. My grandfather Victor, my mother's father, was an 80-year-old billionaire who built his fortune in commercial real estate. He loved me in his own distant way, but Diane controlled the narrative. Every report he received painted me as difficult, withdrawn, and determined to reject the family's help. He believed her because she cried convincingly, and because believing her was easier than confronting the alternative. When I turned 18, I finally asked the question I had been afraid to ask for years. My mother had established a trust fund for me before she died, $3 million, meant to ensure I would never struggle the way she had in her early life. Diane sat me down with a folder full of documents, spreadsheets, showing tuition payments, medical expenses, housing costs, and childcare fees spanning 8 years. She explained with practiced sympathy that raising a child was expensive, and that the trust had been depleted years ago. I had no reason to doubt her. I didn't know then that every number on those pages was a lie, that the money had been quietly funneled into accounts bearing Hadley's name, paying for her education, while I worked 2 jobs to pay for my own. I simply nodded, thanked her for being honest, and walked away believing I had nothing. I built my life from that nothing. I earned scholarships through sheer stubbornness, graduated with honors, and started a consulting business that nobody in my family knew about because nobody in my family ever asked. I didn't use the Maddox name. I didn't attend family events. I became invisible by choice because being seen by them had only ever brought pain. When Hurricane Elena hit Miami, I did what I always did during a crisis. I showed up at the local charity shelter to help. I had been volunteering there for years, sorting donations, serving meals, and sometimes just sitting with people who needed someone to listen. The storm was catastrophic, one of the worst in decades, and the shelter quickly filled beyond capacity. I worked 18-hour days without complaint because this was where I felt useful, where my presence actually mattered. On the third night, I was organizing supply boxes when a woman approached me. Her name was Maria Alvarez, the shelter's director, a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and silver streaks in her dark hair. She had been watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She was staring at the locket around my neck, the heart-shaped pendant I had worn every day since my mother's funeral. Her hands were trembling as she reached toward it, stopping just short of touching it. She asked me where I got it, and something in her tone made my heart stop. Then she said a name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in over 2 decades, a name my stepmother had systematically erased from every conversation, every photo album, every family memory. She said my mother's name. She said Frances. Maria's voice hung in the air like a ghost returning after 2 decades of silence. Frances. My mother's name. I hadn't heard anyone speak it with such reverence, such recognition since the day we buried her. I stood frozen among the supply boxes, my hand instinctively reaching for the locket, as if to protect it from whatever was about to happen. Maria's eyes were filling with tears, and before I could ask how she knew that name, she pulled me into a quiet corner of the shelter where the noise of crying children and exhausted volunteers couldn't reach us. She told me everything. 22 years ago, Maria had been a hospice nurse, and my mother had been one of her patients during those final terrible weeks. She described my mother's grace, her humor even in pain, and the way she talked about me constantly, her little Ellie, the daughter she was terrified to leave behind. Maria remembered the locket because my mother had clutched it during her last conscious hours, whispering that it would protect me when she no longer could. When Maria saw me wearing it in the shelter, she felt like she was seeing a miracle and a tragedy at the same time. A miracle because I was alive and clearly strong. A tragedy because I was here in a disaster shelter, living nothing like the life my mother had dreamed for me. I tried to explain that I was volunteering, not homeless, but Maria wasn't satisfied with that answer. She asked me pointed questions about my life, my family, my relationship with my grandfather. When I admitted that I hadn't spoken to Victor in nearly 3 years and that my stepmother had been my guardian after my father's death, something hardened in Maria's expression. She excused herself and walked to the shelter's small administrative office. I didn't know it then, but she was about to change my life with a single phone call. The next morning, a black limousine appeared outside the shelter. I was helping distribute breakfast when Victor Maddox walked through the door, looking utterly out of place in his tailored wool coat among the cots and folding tables. He scanned the room with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent decades commanding boardrooms, and when his eyes found me, I saw something I had never seen on his face before: confusion. I wasn't cowering in a corner waiting to be rescued. I wasn't disheveled or broken or begging for help. I was standing at the front of a distribution line, clipboard in hand, directing volunteers with calm authority. I was leading. He approached me slowly as if I might disappear if he moved too quickly. His first words were not a greeting but a question. He asked what I was doing here. I told him I was volunteering, that I had been volunteering at this shelter for years, and that the hurricane had simply increased the need. He looked around at the organized chaos I had helped create, the efficient flow of supplies, the volunteers who clearly deferred to my judgment, and I watched the narrative he had believed for 18 years begin to crack. Diane had painted me as a failure, a difficult child who rejected every opportunity and pushed away everyone who tried to help. But failures don't command rooms. Difficult people don't earn the trust of strangers in crisis. We talked for nearly an hour, sitting on folding chairs in a corner while the shelter hummed with activity around us. I kept my voice steady and my emotions controlled. I told him about my consulting business, the clients I had helped save from bankruptcy, the life I had built entirely without the Maddox name or money. He listened with an expression that shifted from disbelief to something closer to shame. He admitted that Diane called him regularly, with updates about me, always the same story. Ellie was struggling. Ellie refused help. Ellie was too proud to accept what was offered. He had sent money through Diane many times over the years, believing it would reach me eventually when I was ready to accept it. I felt my stomach turn. I had never seen a cent of that money. I had never even known it existed. Before I could respond, Victor's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and I saw Diane's name flash before he answered. He put it on speaker without thinking, perhaps too shaken to remember I was sitting beside him. Diane's voice poured out thick with practiced concern and just enough tears to sound authentic. She said she had heard Victor was at some shelter looking for me, and she needed to warn him. She said I had always been like this, creating dramatic situations for attention, refusing perfectly good help just to make the family look bad. She said she had tried so many times to reach out, but I was impossible. Just impossible, and she didn't want Victor to fall for whatever performance I was putting on now. I watched my grandfather's face as he listened. For the first time in my memory, he didn't immediately agree with her. He didn't offer comfort or take her side. He simply said he would call her back and ended the call. Then he looked at me with eyes that seemed 20 years older than they had an hour ago. He asked me to tell him the truth. Not Diane's version, not the family's version, my version. I took a breath and made a decision I had been preparing for over a decade. I told him about the trust fund, about the expense reports Diane had shown me at 18, about the way every dollar had supposedly been spent on my upbringing, while I worked double shifts to pay for community college. I told him I had spent the last 10 years quietly collecting evidence because something never felt right. Bank statements that showed transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. Emails I had found on an old family computer where Diane discussed Hadley's education fund in amounts that seemed impossibly large for a girl whose mother claimed to have no money. I had kept copies of everything hidden in a safety deposit box, waiting for the moment when someone with actual authority would be willing to listen. I never thought that moment would come at a hurricane shelter with my grandfather sitting across from me, looking like his world was falling apart. Victor didn't say much after that. He stood slowly, squeezed my shoulder in a way he hadn't done since I was a child, and promised he would look into everything. I watched him walk back to his limousine, his shoulders heavy with the weight of questions he should have asked years ago. That night in his study at the Maddox estate, Victor unlocked a safe he hadn't opened in 22 years. He had almost forgotten it existed, buried behind newer documents and more pressing concerns. Inside was a letter, yellowed with age, addressed to him in handwriting he would recognize anywhere. It was from Frances, written 3 days before she died. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. The first line read, "Father, if you're reading this, it means Diane has won, unless you choose to see the truth." 3 days after Victor found my mother's letter, I received a phone call that changed everything. His voice was different, stripped of the distant formality I had grown accustomed to over the years. He asked me to come to the estate for a family meeting. He said Samuel Brooks, the family's attorney, would be present. He said I should bring any documentation I had. The way he said it told me he already knew what I had been hiding for a decade. I agreed without hesitation. I had been waiting for this moment since I was 22 years old, since the first time I noticed a bank statement that didn't match Diane's carefully constructed lies. I arrived at the Maddox estate on a Thursday afternoon, carrying a leather folder that contained 10 years of my life's work. Not the consulting projects or client proposals that paid my bills, but something far more personal. Copies of financial statements I had obtained through careful persistence, screenshots of emails I had discovered on an old family computer that Diane had carelessly donated without wiping clean, receipts and records that painted a picture so damning that no amount of tears or manipulation could erase it. I had gathered this evidence slowly, methodically, never telling anyone what I was doing, because I knew that without someone powerful enough to demand accountability, my proof meant nothing. Diane had too many friends, too much social capital, too many years of playing the devoted stepmother. I needed more than evidence. I needed an ally with authority, and now finally, I had one. The library where we gathered was a room I remembered from childhood, back when my mother would read to me by the fireplace, while my grandfather worked at his desk. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, a version of Ellie who still believed that family meant safety. Victor sat at the head of the long oak table, looking every one of his 80 years. Samuel Brooks, a distinguished man in his early 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes, sat to his right with a stack of folders that made my leather case look modest by comparison. Diane and Hadley arrived together. Diane wearing an expression of wounded confusion that I recognized immediately as her opening performance. Hadley simply looked uncomfortable, glancing between her mother and Victor as if trying to read the room. Samuel spoke first. He had spent the past 72 hours conducting an emergency audit of the trust my mother had established before her death. His findings were, in his words, deeply troubling. He laid out the numbers with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing an autopsy. The original trust had contained $3 million designated solely for my education, housing, and living expenses until I reached the age of 30. Over the 18 years of Diane's management, the fund had been systematically drained through a series of administrative expenses and family education costs. Every withdrawal was technically legal because Diane had been granted broad discretionary power as trustee. But when Samuel traced where the money actually went, the picture became clear. Hadley's prep school tuition at $40,000 per year for 6 years. Hadley's 4 years at a private university totaling over $200,000. Hadley's luxury apartment in Manhattan, her car, her living expenses, her credit card bills. In total, I had received less than $40,000 over 18 years, mostly in the form of basic necessities that Diane could document as childcare expenses. The rest, nearly $3 million of my inheritance, had funded my stepsister's entire adult life. Diane immediately began to cry. She insisted there had been a misunderstanding, that the expenses were all legitimate, that raising 2 children was expensive, and she had done her best with limited resources. But Samuel wasn't finished. He had recovered emails from the backup servers of an old family account emails that Diane had clearly forgotten existed. He read one aloud, and the room fell completely silent. The email was from Diane to a friend, written 12 years ago, and it contained a confession more damaging than any financial record. Frances got everything Diane had written. Victor's love, Robert's devotion, even in death, she still worshipped like some kind of saint. And Ellie is just an extension of her, a constant reminder of the woman everyone loved more than me. Why should she inherit what I built? Why should Frances win from the grave? I watched Diane's face as her own words were read back to her. For the first time in my life, I saw her mask slip completely. The tearful, concerned stepmother disappeared, replaced by something cold and cornered. She tried to dismiss the email as old frustration taken out of context, but Victor raised his hand, and she fell silent. Then my grandfather did something I never expected. He confessed. He told us that he had read my mother's letter years ago, shortly after my father died. Frances had written it as a warning, explaining that she didn't trust Diane, that she feared what would happen to me if Diane gained control of my inheritance and my upbringing. Frances had begged her father to watch over me, to question Diane's decisions, to protect me from someone she described as deeply envious and skilled at hiding it. Victor admitted that he had read every word. And then he had put the letter away and chosen to believe that his dying daughter was paranoid, that her illness had made her suspicious and unfair. He chose peace over investigation. He chose comfort over his granddaughter. He looked at me as he said this, and I saw tears on his face for the first time in my life. Diane seized on Victor's confession, trying to redirect blame. She pointed out that even he hadn't believed Frances, so how could anyone expect her to be held responsible for decisions that were made with the family's full knowledge? But I had heard enough. I stood and walked to the table, placing my leather folder beside Samuel's documents. I opened it and spread 10 years of evidence across the polished oak surface. Bank statements with highlighted discrepancies. Screenshots of emails discussing Hadley's expenses in amounts that matched withdrawals from my trust. Records showing that money Victor had sent for me over the years had been deposited into accounts I never knew existed. I looked directly at Diane as I spoke. I told her that I didn't wait for someone to rescue me. I waited until I had enough evidence to make sure she couldn't lie her way out. I had been collecting proof since I was 22 years old, since the day I realized that the numbers in her expense reports didn't add up. I was never the helpless orphan she wanted everyone to believe I was. I was patient, and patience in the end was more powerful than all her manipulation. The room was completely still. Victor rose slowly from his chair and turned to face Diane with an expression I had never seen before. His voice was ice as he spoke. He told her she would return every dollar. He told her she would face the courts. and he told her she would never speak to his granddaughter again. Diane's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing without sound, but it was the gasp from beside her that echoed through the room. Hadley, who had sat silent through every revelation, was staring at her mother with an expression of dawning horror. The weeks that followed the family meeting moved with a momentum I had never anticipated. What began as a private confrontation in my grandfather's library quickly became a legal matter that consumed everyone involved. Samuel Brooks moved swiftly once Victor authorized him to pursue every avenue of accountability. Criminal charges were filed against Diane for embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty charges that carried the weight of nearly $3 million in misappropriated funds. The evidence I had gathered over 10 years, combined with Samuel's forensic audit, created a case so airtight that Diane's expensive attorneys could only negotiate for leniency rather than innocence. The trial was brief but devastating. Diane stood before the judge looking nothing like the polished society woman who had controlled my childhood. Her designer clothes couldn't hide the hollow desperation in her eyes, and her carefully practiced tears no longer moved anyone who mattered. The prosecution laid out 18 years of systematic theft, documenting every fraudulent expense report, every redirected payment, every lie she had told to maintain her scheme. In the end, the judge showed more mercy than I would have. Diane avoided prison due to her age and lack of prior criminal record, but the sentence was far from gentle. 5 years of probation with strict financial monitoring. Mandatory restitution of every dollar she had stolen to be paid from the sale of assets she had accumulated using my inheritance. Permanent removal from any involvement in Maddox family financial affairs. And perhaps most painful for a woman who had built her identity on social status, her name was now public record as a convicted embezzler. The society that Diane had spent decades cultivating turned on her with breathtaking speed. The country club where she had lunched every Wednesday quietly revoked her membership. The charity boards where she had posed for photographs and accepted awards for generosity asked for her resignation. Friends who had attended her parties and praised her elegance stopped returning her calls. I watched from a distance as the empire of reputation she had built on my stolen money crumbled into dust. I felt no joy in her destruction, no satisfaction in seeing her brought low. I felt only a quiet relief that the lies had finally stopped, that the woman who had made me feel worthless for 18 years could no longer hurt me or anyone else. Hadley's fall was different, more complicated in ways that surprised me. She had been cut off from Maddox family money, completely forced for the first time in her 30 years to consider how she would support herself without the endless flow of funds she had always taken for granted. She lost her Manhattan apartment because she couldn't pay the rent. She sold her car because she couldn't afford the insurance. But her greater crisis wasn't financial. It was the slow, terrible realization that everything she believed about her life was built on theft and lies. She came to see me one afternoon appearing at my Miami apartment without warning, looking like a woman who hadn't slept in weeks. I almost didn't recognize her without the designer clothes and professional styling that had always made her look like she belonged in a magazine. She sat across from me at my small kitchen table and asked the question that had clearly been consuming her. She asked if I hated her. I considered my answer carefully before speaking. I told her the truth, which was that I didn't hate her. I pitied her. I explained that she had spent her entire life being loved conditionally, valued only for what she represented in her mother's twisted competition with a dead woman. Every gift Diane gave her, every opportunity, every advantage had been purchased with stolen money and motivated by jealousy rather than genuine maternal love. Hadley had never been loved for who she was. She had been loved as a weapon, a way for Diane to prove that her daughter deserved more than Francis's daughter. Now that the money was gone and the scheme exposed, Hadley would finally discover whether her mother's affection had any substance beneath the manipulation. I watched tears stream down her face as she absorbed my words. She didn't argue or defend herself. She simply nodded, stood, and left without another word. I never saw her again after that day, but I heard through Samuel that she eventually moved to a small town in Vermont, took a job at a local nonprofit, and began building a life that had nothing to do with the Maddox name or money. Victor's attempts at reconciliation were the hardest to navigate. He called me repeatedly in the weeks after Diane's sentencing, leaving voicemails that ranged from formal apologies to tearful pleas for a chance to make things right. He sent letters, flowers, even a representative from his office to request a meeting. Each time I declined. When he finally appeared at my door, in person, looking frail and desperate in a way I had never seen, I forced myself to say the words I had been rehearsing for weeks. I told him that I wasn't ready to forgive him. I reminded him that he had read my mother's letter, that he had known about Diane's true nature, and that he had chosen his own comfort over his granddaughter's well-being. He had watched me struggle for 18 years, while he convinced himself that I was the problem, that I was difficult and ungrateful, because believing that was easier than confronting the woman who was robbing me. I told him that forgiveness couldn't be bought with apologies or gifts. If he wanted to be part of my life, he would have to earn it through consistent action over time. He would have to prove that he had changed, not just tell me he was sorry. He accepted my terms without argument, and for the first time I saw something like respect in his eyes. Maria found me a week later at the shelter where our paths had first crossed. The hurricane cleanup was nearly complete, but I still came to volunteer whenever I could. She approached me with an envelope that looked older than I was, yellowed and soft from years of careful storage. She explained that my mother had given it to her during those final days in hospice with instructions to keep it safe until the right moment. For 22 years, Maria had honored that request, never knowing when or if the moment would come. But when she saw me at the shelter, wearing my mother's locket and carrying myself with a strength that reminded her so much of Frances, she knew the time had finally arrived. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single page covered in my mother's handwriting, the letters shaky from illness, but still unmistakably hers. My darling girl, she had written. If you're reading this, it means you survived whatever challenges life placed in your path after I left. I am so proud of you, more proud than these words could ever express. I need you to know something important, something I feared you might forget in the years without me there to remind you. You are enough. You were always enough. Don't let anyone, not Diane, not the family, not the world, make you believe otherwise. You carry my love with you always in that locket in your heart, in the woman you have become. Live fully, love fiercely, and never apologize for taking up space in a world that tried to make you invisible. I held my mother's letter as tears fell silently onto the paper. For the first time in 22 years, I felt her presence surrounding me, warm and protective and impossibly close. The grief I had carried since childhood loosened its grip, replaced by something lighter, something that felt like permission to finally move forward. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. 6 months after the trial ended, I stood on the porch of a small cottage overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, and finally understood what freedom felt like. The restitution had come through completely. Every dollar that Diane had stolen returned to me through the sale of her assets and the liquidation of accounts that had been built on my inheritance. For the first time in my life, I had the financial resources to live however I chose. Victor had offered me a suite at the Maddox estate, a gesture I knew was motivated by genuine desire to reconnect rather than obligation. Samuel had suggested several luxury properties that would befit someone of my newly restored means. Everyone seemed to expect me to step into the life I had been denied, to finally claim my place among the wealthy elite that had always existed just beyond my reach. Instead, I bought a 3-bedroom cottage in a quiet coastal town an hour south of Miami. It had a wraparound porch, a small garden that needed work, and a view of the ocean that took my breath away every single morning. It cost a fraction of what I could have afforded, and it was perfect. I spent the first week there doing nothing but sitting on that porch, drinking coffee, and listening to the waves. I had spent 22 years trying to prove that I belonged, fighting for recognition from people who had already decided I was worthless. Now I finally understood that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. This cottage, this view, this quiet life I was building with my own 2 hands was proof enough that I had always been exactly who I needed to be. The rest of my inheritance went towards something that mattered far more than property or possessions. I worked with Samuel and a team of nonprofit specialists to establish the Francis Maddox Foundation, a scholarship fund dedicated to supporting children who had lost one or both parents at a young age. The criteria were simple. The recipients had to demonstrate resilience, self-motivation, and a commitment to building their own futures, rather than waiting for someone to rescue them. The scholarships covered education expenses, mentorship programs, and emergency support for young people navigating the impossible task of growing up without the parents who should have been there to guide them. I chose the foundation's motto, carefully pulling it directly from the letter my mother had written 22 years ago. "You are enough." Those 3 words were printed on every piece of foundation correspondence, every scholarship certificate, every banner at the events we hosted. I wanted every recipient to carry that message with them, the way I now carried it with me, a reminder that their worth was never determined by the people who failed them. Victor respected my boundaries in ways I had never expected from a man who had spent 8 decades being obeyed without question. He didn't call unless I called first. He didn't visit unless I invited him. He sent no gifts, no letters, no intermediaries to plead his case. Instead, he did something far more meaningful. He donated anonymously to the Francis Maddox Foundation amounts that I only discovered months later when reviewing the financial reports. He volunteered his business connections to help the foundation secure partnerships with universities and corporations. He spoke about my mother in interviews, publicly acknowledging for the first time that Frances had been the heart of the Maddox family and that her loss had created a void he had foolishly tried to fill with silence and denial. He didn't ask for credit or recognition. He simply did the work quietly and consistently, proving through action what words alone could never accomplish. Our first real conversation happened 6 months to the day after I told him I wasn't ready to forgive. I invited him to meet me at the shelter where Maria still worked, the same place where our paths had crossed during the hurricane that changed everything. He arrived looking nervous in a way I had never seen, dressed casually in clothes that suggested he understood this wasn't a formal occasion. We sat at a small table in the corner of the community room, surrounded by the gentle chaos of volunteers and families rebuilding their lives. Maria brought us coffee and squeezed my shoulder before leaving us alone. For the first hour, we simply talked, not about the trial or Diane or the money that had been stolen. We talked about my mother sharing memories that neither of us had spoken aloud in decades. He told me about Frances as a child, curious and stubborn and utterly convinced that she could change the world if people would just listen. I told him about the fragments I remembered, her laugh, her smell, the way she made everything feel safe. We cried together for the first time in my life, grieving not just Frances, but all the years we had lost to lies and silence. When it was time to leave, Victor didn't ask if I had forgiven him. He simply thanked me for the coffee and said he hoped we could do this again sometime. I told him I would like that. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something equally important. It was a beginning. The last thing I needed to do was the hardest. I had avoided my mother's grave for years, unable to face the headstone that reduced her entire existence to a name and 2 dates. But on a quiet Sunday morning in early spring, I drove to the cemetery where she had been buried 22 years ago. The plot was well maintained, covered in fresh flowers that I later learned Victor had been placing there every week since the trial ended. I knelt beside the headstone and removed the heart-shaped locket from around my neck. I had worn it every day since her funeral, a talisman against a world that had tried so hard to erase her memory. But I didn't need to carry it anymore. Her memory lived in the foundation that bore her name, in the scholarships that would help children like me survive impossible circumstances in the quiet cottage by the ocean, where I was finally building a life that honored everything she had wanted for me. I placed the locket gently on the headstone, letting my fingers rest against the cold stone for a moment. I whispered 2 words that contained everything I had never been able to say. Thank you. Thank you for loving me enough to write that letter. Thank you for seeing Diane clearly when no one else would. Thank you for believing in me before I knew how to believe in myself. Then I stood, brushed the grass from my knees, and walked away without looking back. Not because I wanted to forget her, but because I was finally free to remember her without pain. I walked into the sunlight feeling lighter than I had in decades. I hadn't won because I defeated anyone. I won because I finally stopped carrying the weight of people who never deserved my loyalty. The family that should have protected me had failed in every way that mattered, but their failure no longer defined me. I was Eleanor Maddox, daughter of Francis, survivor of Diane, and author of my own story. And somewhere beyond the blue sky and the crashing waves, I knew my mother was smiling. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that the greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming the person your enemies never believed you could be. Diane spent 18 years trying to erase me to make me feel small and unworthy of the inheritance my mother left behind. She almost succeeded, but she made one fatal mistake. She underestimated the daughter of Francis Maddox. She thought silence meant weakness. She thought patience meant surrender. She never imagined that the quiet girl she dismissed as worthless was watching, waiting, and building a case that would eventually bring her entire empire of lies crashing down around her. Today, the Francis Maddox Foundation has helped over 200 children who lost their parents find their way to college and beyond. Victor and I meet for coffee every month at the shelter where Maria still works, rebuilding a relationship that should have existed all along. And I wake up every morning in my little cottage by the ocean, grateful for a life that belongs entirely to me. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever been made to feel invisible by the people who should have loved you most, I want you to know something. You are enough. You were always enough. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to wait years for justice? How did you find the strength to keep going? I read every single comment, and your stories inspire me more than you know. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, because trust me, it's going to be just as powerful as this one.